To help give you a better idea of the difference of the paper surfaces, I'm going to work on the same image of a single pair, the hot press paper on the left and the cold on the right. And as I work on these, you'll see how I create more color by layering. And instead of working a wash on the entire painting, I'm only going to apply it to the image area. It's basically the same idea. I'm applying the water to the area that I want to work on, so the color can blend. And it's not necessary to go all the way up to the pencil line, just close. And this time what I want to do is leave a few areas dry in the center, because those are going to become my highlights. Once I'm satisfied with the water I've applied, I can then start thinking of my color mix. I'm going to choose a little quinacridone gold and yellow ochre. And now I can bring the color all the way up to the pencil line. The water that's on the surface is actually going to help the color blend out, so I won't have any hard lines. You can see how the center is staying white. That's because this area is dry. And to make this more interesting and give it more shape, I'm going to start to add other colors. I'll begin with a little alizarin crimson and go only into a few areas and allow it to blend into the quinacridone gold mix. Then I'll take a little permanent sap green on a number 24 round brush and just add a little color here and there. This way it'll be able to blend into the other colors without getting muddy. Then I'll come in with some additional water to help blend the color and soften the edges. I still want to retain some of these white areas because it's going to help give this pear more dimension. When working on hot press paper, I really want to take advantage of this paper surface, so I actually enjoy using more water and allowing the backwashes to happen because it makes the painting more interesting. And I'm not going to expect the outcome to be the same as on the cold, because it's just not going to happen. To help give it more shape, I've added a little French ultramarine blue to help give it the illusion of rolling over. As I allow this to dry, I'm going to move on and show you the same example on cold press paper. I'll add my water, then leave my dry highlighted areas, then add my quinacridone gold and yellow ochre mix and go up to the pencil line edges. Then I'll allow the color to blend into the clean water, then repeat the same color application as I did on the hot press, using alizarin crimson, permanent sap green, and then I'll allow the colors to blend. Once I have my colors in the areas that I think I want it, I can then again lift my paper and help move the colors even more. You can really see how much water I have on my surface and how the color moves. Don't be afraid of the water. Experiment and have fun. This is what the magic of watercolor is. Side by side, you can still see how the hot press paper on the left continues to hold the water on the surface. And if I need to, I can always use the tip of a clean brush to help soak it up. Again, you can see how much lighter the watercolor becomes when it's dry. So this is when I need to add another layer. I'll want to make sure that it's completely dry. Then I'll go back and basically reapply the same colors that I had on the first layer. I'm using the quinacridone gold mixed in with the alizarin crimson. Also notice that for this layer, I'm applying it directly to dry paper. This will help me have a richer saturation in these direct areas. Then once I have the color down, I'm going to use a clean brush and help soften out the edges. And since I'm working with hot press, I want to use this paper to my advantage, meaning that I want the backwashes and the jeweled glazing effects. So my intention is not trying to blend everything evenly. Then I'll move on to the pear on cold press. I'm going to use the same technique applying the color to dry paper. Then to soften out the hard line, I'll use clean water. Again, I'm going to reapply the color to the areas that I placed it initially. Then by using the water, I'll allow it to blend into the center. By placing the sap green and French ultramarine just a little bit away from the edge, it'll help to give this pear more shape, because the lighter color that's close to the edge is actually going to be reflective light. Then again, to blend my color, I'll lift my paper and move it around. Then I'll wipe off my painting table to prevent any backwashes into the painting. And for any hard lines around the highlight, I'll use a clean brush to help soften it out. If I go back to the pear on the hot press paper, you can see how much water is still standing on top. So I'm going to move the color and help blend it a little more. And I actually want to take advantage of the hard lines, because I'm intentionally working towards a different effect on the hot press. And in comparison, you can tell how the pear on the cold press paper has settled nicely. Once it's dry, I can add my third and final layer. You can always add more if you'd like. Again, I want to make sure that this is completely dry, so I don't lift any of the previous layer. Then I'll again be reapplying the color to where I placed it initially. That way the center will be lighter, which will help it have more shape. Once again, lift the paper, blend the color, then let it rest. Once I've added about 3 layers to the pear, I can start thinking of my shadow. I'm going to choose a combination of French ultramarine blue and perhaps a little indigo. You can see how the blue on the hot press won't settle evenly, but that's part of the trait of this paper, so don't fight it, work with it. Maybe think of your paintings being a little looser, or if you want them to be very tight and accurate, use less water. When you're ready to create the detail of the stem, use a number 6 or 8 round brush. Hold it higher up the handle so it's loose in your hand, and try to simplify your strokes, because it actually adds more. I'll use the same technique on the cold press, and watch how evenly it goes on. I'm applying the color directly to dry paper, so I hold the integrity of the color saturation. And by using the complementary color as the shadow, look how much richer all the color becomes. Now to help separate them and show you how they look individually, I'll place a mat around them. It's always a good idea to have one of these on hand because it can help you have a new perspective. It can help show you that a painting that you thought wasn't working may actually look great, and it also may give you an idea that you better stop because you're on the verge of overworking a piece. Now let's look at both pears side by side. You can see how the paper's a little warped. That's because I didn't attach it to a board, but I'm going to show you now how to fix that. I actually have a couple of options. I can use a flat surface, such as this piece of cardboard, then place a clean towel over it. Then take my painting and place it face down on the towel. Then I can spray the back with clean water. Once I've applied the water evenly, I can then take this masonite board and place it on the back of the painting. Using a board is going to help me to apply even pressure. And to apply additional weight, I can use anything on hand. Then I'll take this and move it over to the side and allow it to completely dry. Another option I have, and a quicker way to flatten the painting, is to take a clean towel, place it on my painting surface, then take the painting and place it face down on the towel. Then again, I'll spray clean water evenly on the back of the painting. Then I'll take an iron and place it on a low heat and gently iron the back. You don't want to have your heat setting too high, or you can actually curl it again in the opposite direction. You really don't need to be afraid of using this technique. Once you've sprayed the back and placed your painting on a clean towel, the towel will absorb any water along the edges. If you're uncomfortable about actually ironing the back of the paper itself, you can always use a buffer. This can be a paper towel or a clean cloth. Then when you're done, simply flip it back over and it should be flat. Now let's go back to the pressed painting. Again, once it's dry, remove the board and it should be completely flat. Now let's move on to different effects that you can add into your paintings. Here's another technique that's a lot of fun and very effective. It's created simply by adding salt on top of color. You can use this for many landscapes, abstracts, or even the backgrounds of still lifes. And depending on how much water is on the surface, can affect the outcome. Side by side, you can really see the difference. The example on the left had less water on the surface and more of a matte appearance before I applied the salt, while the example on the right had more water and it actually has the appearance of movement. If you decide to try this technique, you don't necessarily only have to work with table salt. I'm going to show you a couple of different kinds. First is raw sea salt. You can see how the texture is different than your average everyday table salt. And in comparison, rock salt. You can see how it's larger and it almost looks like little pebbles. Next is your average everyday table salt, and how this has the appearance of fine sand. Starting with my first demonstration, I'm going to take my piece of paper, wet the surface, then add my color. Then I'll lift the paper so the colors can blend. Once I'm satisfied with the blending, I can then start to add my salt. Look at what's happening here. The color is being repelled by the salt, while some is going to be absorbed. To make it more interesting, I'm going to add some raw sea salt. The change is gradual, and you're not likely to see the effect happen. And if I want to, I can even splatter more color on top of it to see what's going to happen. Then once I'm satisfied, I'll move it over to the side and allow it to dry. Then for the next demonstration, I'll apply the color directly to dry paper. This way the example won't be as damp as the previous one. I'll use the same combination of table and sea salt. And again, once I'm satisfied with it, I'll move it over to the side and allow it to dry. Now you can see the comparison of before and after. The examples on the left are in the process of creating the crystal-like appearance. So once you've applied your color, then your salt, allow it to completely dry. Then when you're ready, you can simply remove the salt. Look at how dramatic the textures become. Imagine using darker colors, such as blues, greens, or even browns. This could make a wonderful background effect. Now here's an unusual idea using the same technique, but a different substance. I'm going to prepare my paper and lay my color down. But this time, I'm going to use coffee grounds. Watch as I apply the grounds and how the color wants to move away from it. What's going to be happening is that the coffee grounds are actually going to stain the paper. And if I want to, I can even do more splattering. And just as I did with the salt, I'm going to allow all of this to dry before I remove it. At this time, I'm going to show you another way of splattering. You can use a flat or filbert brush and simply drag your finger across the bristles. This technique creates a finer spray, which can work beautifully if you wanted to paint a beach or anything that has a mist to it. Now the coffee and all the splattering should be dry, and I can go ahead and shake it off. You can now see the darker pigment and the staining that's left. This technique would work really well if you want to create stones, rocks, or even walls. Here's another technique that can achieve almost the same results as the salt in half of the time. I'm first going to apply my color to my paper and allow it to start drying. As the glisten starts to leave the surface and it becomes more matte, I can then start to work with it. Now watch as I start to splatter only water on the surface. The results are immediate, and you can see what's happening right before your eyes. You don't want to splatter too much water or there won't be any effect. Add a little and allow it to start to dry again. I like to add this technique when I work on succulents or rocks. You can even splatter additional color to change the texture. When you're doing this technique, hold your brush higher up the handle so it has a lot of bounce in it. Then simply tap the tip with your index finger. By doing it this way, you're actually directing the pattern of the splatter. Look at the beautiful blending of the colors and the effect together. Now I want to show you an unusual kind of texture that you can apply to your painting. The blended color combination that I have here almost looks like it's underneath this layer of texture. There's no secret to this, and it's extremely simple. So I'm first going to get my paper and saturate the surface with clean water, then apply my color. I can be as messy as I want when I'm doing this, because the amount of water I have on my surface will help blend it all together. Then once I feel I've put enough color on the surface, I'll lift my paper up and move it around so the colors can blend. Then I'll take a piece of saran wrap. You can use any kind that you like. Then I'll place it on top of the wet color. Crunch it up a little, create little air pockets, use your imagination. Then once you're satisfied with it, allow it to dry this way. Then I'll clean off my surface so I don't have any unwanted color going into the next piece of paper. Now I'm going to use the same idea, but instead of saran wrap, I'll use aluminum foil. But first I have to get the color on the surface. I'm going to use the color combination of French ultramarine blue mixed with alizarin crimson, because both of those colors will want to separate a little. Then once I'm satisfied with the color application, I'll take my aluminum foil and crunch it up and apply it again to the wet paper. And I'll want to flatten it a little, and then allow it to dry. Once dry, I'll remove the aluminum foil to see the texture that's left. And I'll do the same thing to the piece with the saran wrap. You can see how different the effects are. Experiment with your colors and how to apply this to a painting. You never know where it's going to be best suited. Now here's another technique to add more texture to your paintings. What I'll be using are some simple crayons. And if you don't have that, a candle will do. You can use this on abstracts or landscapes or anything else you can think of. What this wax does is act like a resist. I'm going to create a very simple composition. Imagine the green lichen on a rock, along with a few blades of grass. Then I'll use my watercolor and go over the area that I just drew. You can see how the water rolls off the waxy crayon. You could continue to build the density of the crayon or wax as much as you'd like to create more texture. Then I'll create a great big bold sun in the sky. Then I'll place a nice blue wash of color over it. You can be as creative as you want with this technique. And if you have any children around, they enjoy this too. Now I'd like to show you how to create a soft and impressionistic painting by using the wet into wet technique. The idea is to saturate the surface with water, then simply drop color in and allow it to move. So you're really playing with water and color, and it can become semi-abstracted, or you can create a very soft painting. Once I'm satisfied with the amount of water that I've applied to the surface, I'm going to take a number 14 round and use a little alizarin crimson and drop some color into little clusters. These little drops of color are actually going to represent the petals on a flower. For cleaner colors, keep them separated. That way they can blend and move without getting muddy. And if you're painting with children, they really love this technique too. Watch as I apply my yellow and how it explodes into the clean water. Yellows are very active pigments. You can see how it works beautifully for the center of the flowers. Notice when I apply the alizarin crimson on top of the yellow, it doesn't move very much. You could also use this technique to find out which colors are more active than others. I'm not going to be concerned about the feathered edges. I'm going to allow it to continue to blend. For the stems, I'm going to add a little permanent sap green. But notice how I want to keep a little distance between the color. While it's wet, everything is still fluid and continues to move, so I don't need to paint right next to each color. Then for the sky, I'm going to add a little French ultramarine blue. Once it's dry, I can either create another layer or use a permanent Sharpie marker and outline the flower images. This is a wonderful idea for the backgrounds of paintings because it helps bring the viewer's eye into the main subject of whatever you're painting. It also stands beautifully on its own. If I need to, I can increase some of the color that I'm already using, but try not to overwork this, or it can easily get muddy. Keep it simple, then move it over to the side and allow it to dry. Let's say you're going to go traveling and you want to do a watercolor sketchbook, but you don't want to spend a lot of time at any one location. So what do? You have to capture the essence. You could create a pencil sketch, then add your watercolor. Or you could do a loose line drawing with a Sharpie permanent marker. The advantage of using this pen is that the color won't bleed when water is applied. For an example, I'm going to create a very simple sketch of a couple mountains, trees, a lake, and a meadow. When you're working on your sketch, try not to get caught up in too many details. Simplify. For this particular painting, I'm going to be working on dry paper. This way I'll have a combination of the hard lines and I can use wet into wet in areas that I want to. For the sky, I'm going to use French ultramarine blue. And watch how I hold my brush to create the clouds. By holding it more at an angle, I can catch the tooth of the paper, which helps to give the clouds that puffy appearance. I'm painting up to my sketch lines, but I really don't care if I go out of them a little. Applying water and color this way, you can actually work very quickly. I'm not going to be concerned if one color happens to bleed into another, because the outline is still going to define the image. I'll paint around the area of the lake and then add a little blue and allow it to blend into the green of the hills. Then for the meadow, I'll add a little yellow ochre and allow it to blend into the green and blue. This helps to give it a soft appearance. To make it more interesting and perhaps give the illusion of flowers in the field, I'll add a few dots of alizarin crimson. Then I'll allow it to dry a little, but I still want the paper to be damp when I add my trees. The advantage of this is that I'll have a combination of some soft feathering effects and hard lines. It'll help to create an illusion of more trees instead of having to paint every one individually. Then I'll allow it to dry a little more before I add any other details. Now the rest is up to you. You can decide if you need to add anything else. You can really capture the essence of your experience by not overworking it. Here's another technique to use on many paintings. Take an old toothbrush, have it face down, and take your thumb and drag it along the bristles. You'll end up with a fine spray that can be a nice addition to break up the painting and make it more interesting. Now I'd like to show you how to use a straw and create wonderful natural effects, especially for landscapes. The idea is to create a little blob with enough water and color so when you blow through the straw, it can easily move. And if it's not moving where you want it to go, you can create little branches and then blow on them. It'll create more of a natural appearance instead of hard brush lines. This works beautifully for dried brush, reeds, or even trees. I'll show you how I would apply this to a very simple landscape. In this very moody scene, I want to bring the viewer's attention to the foreground. Now, just as I did in the example, I'll take some color and put it on the painting and take my straw and place it at an angle, then blow. I want the straw at an angle so I'll have more control over the direction of the flow. And you won't want to blow too hard, or it can just shoot across your painting. So experiment and practice and have fun with it. This is a fun addition to many landscapes. Now I'll show you how I created this very simple scene, so you can try this. Using a sheet of Arches 140-pound cold-pressed paper, I'm going to flood the surface with clean water. Then using the color combination of burnt umber and French ultramarine blue, I'm going to mix the color together on my palette. Then I'll place the color on the top and the bottom. Then lift my paper and move it around. You can see how the top is actually creating the effect of weather. And the color on the bottom will be the reflection. Now using the same color combination with a little indigo added, I'm going to place a stroke of color just a little off-center. Then by adding a few strokes of color and allowing it to blend into the clean water, it helps to give the illusion of trees. Then I need to create the reflection. An easy way to do that is turn your paper vertically. That way you're not looking at the subject, you're only looking at the shape. Like here you can see, it's almost like a triangle. So what you're doing is creating balance, and if one tree is higher than another, you're going to do the same thing on the opposite side. Then once you're satisfied, allow it to dry. Then once dry, use the straw technique. If you applied this while the paper was still damp, you wouldn't have the strong effect. And to help you get a better perspective of where you are with the painting, put a mat around it. If you don't do that, you may overwork it. Now I'd like to show you how you can create very natural clouds. These are simple, quick, and really easy. I'm going to take my piece of paper, flood the surface, and get some color on it. And for this demonstration, instead of using a light blue sky, I'm going to use a darker color so you can really see how this technique shows up. Starting at the top, then working my way down. Then I'll simply take a paper towel and start to lift some of the color out. Any soft paper towel can work, but it's better to have one that doesn't have a pattern embedded in it, such as Viva. You'll want to crunch up the paper towel into a nice ball, then start lifting the color. After you've lifted the color in a few areas, readjust the towel, then continue to lift, because if you don't, you may end up with little spots in your clouds. Practice with it, add some other colors, add more layers, and simply just have fun. Try other colors for the sky, such as French ultramarine, cobalt, or cerulean blue. And the most important thing is to lift your paper so the color can run back down into the area that you lifted out, because that's what's going to give it the natural appearance. Then you can add some colors underneath your clouds, such as pinks or oranges. It's whatever the composition calls for. Next I'll show you a very simple composition and how to use this technique and apply it to a painting. I'm first going to create a light pencil sketch, so I have a starting point. I'll begin with a house and then add a couple hills. Here's another technique for clouds. You can actually apply it to dry paper. Hold your brush more at an angle and just create the outline as you go along. But here I'm going to use the paper towel and again lift out some of the color in the sky. Then I'll lift my paper and allow the color to run down into the dry area. It's fascinating to see the shapes that are created and where the color decides to settle. Then I'll apply some water to soften up any of the hard edges. Then I'll paint around the area of the house and notice how I intentionally leave that area dry. Then I'll reevaluate and go back in with my paper towel and soften some of the edges. If you notice the hill on the left, you can see how it has a soft line on the horizon. That's because when I applied the green, the paper was still damp. If it was dry, I would have a very hard line, but I want that hard line for the house. You can see how I'm doing the wet into wet all around that area, allowing the browns and the greens and the blues to mix into each other because it gives that watercolor look. When I applied my brush strokes, you can see that I left some white areas in the foreground. I like these random little windows. Then to help really define those whites, I'm going to start adding some darker colors. This will also help to give the illusion of trees. Notice how I'm keeping the hard line of the house dry, because I want to have that striking appearance of the white. But to help it not look too boxy, I'm going to add a shadow line just under the roof. By adding the shadow and having the background still damp at this time, it allows some of the greens to run into the shadow, which helps give it a softer appearance. I've decided that the way the sun's going to be hitting this house is that I'll have a minimal shadow on the front and more of a shadow on the side. By using very little color and more water, I'm going to fill in the side area. And I'm not concerned about any of the background color running into it. But I still want to keep a little definition there. Then I want this to dry a little. But it doesn't have to be completely dry. Just dry enough that when I add my roof, it doesn't completely dissolve into the surrounding color. By using a warmer color, it helps to make this small painting a little more interesting. Notice how I'm leaving a very small white line just around the roof area. This will help to give it more dimension and define it, because it's in contrast with the shadow. Then I'll go back and add some darker colors next to the house. Here I'm starting to create the illusion of trees. Notice how I'm not painting every leaf. I'm using the wet into wet technique to my advantage. And by placing contrasting colors next to each other, see how the white is starting to stand out. When working on the trees, I can always come back in when it's dry and add more minimal details to enhance it. Then I'll add a few strokes of color into the dry foreground to help give it the idea of texture. Then to distract the viewer's eye and to make it more interesting, I'm going to splatter just a few drops of color. Some of it will blend into the still damp areas, and others will look hard. I like the combination of both. Now for the windows. I'll use a number 3 round brush since this is such a small painting. I don't need to make the windowsills or all the little details. I only want to give the illusion that there are windows there. So a few spots of color will do. Keep it simple. You can usually always say much more with less. And before I continue, I want to make sure that the color is completely dry, so the windows and the door won't spread. Then for the side of the house where I'm going to have my door, just a line or two will do just fine. As it dries, I'm going to continually reevaluate because the colors will become lighter, and if I want to have more contrast, I'll again reapply some of the darker color. You can see how I've achieved depth in this simple little painting. It's all about the placement of color. I can keep this as simple or make it as complicated as I like. You don't need to add all the details. Allow the viewer to use their own imagination. Well, thanks for joining me today, and I hope that you've enjoyed yourself. Now remember, it's about giving yourself the permission to have fun and the freedom to explore. There are no mistakes because you're always learning. One of the things that will really help you is discipline. So if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to contact me through my website, birgitoconnor.com. I'll see you next time, and happy painting! Hi, I'm Birgit O'Connor, and welcome to my studio. Today we're going to be talking about watercolor basics. My intention is to give you enough information so you become comfortable with the medium so you can enjoy yourself and have fun. We're going to be discussing pigments, brushes, paper, and a few simple compositions. So first we're going to start with the pigments. Now let's begin. What I like to do, and to help me stay organized, is use a small plastic craft box. You can get these at any art supply, craft store, or even a bait and tackle shop. Some of the color that I always like to have ready and available to me are French ultramarine blue, burnt umber, burnt sienna, permanent alizarin crimson, indigo, purple madder, permanent carmine, quinacridone gold, quinacridone magenta, permanent sap green, and cobalt blue. Some artists like to use only 3 colors, red, yellow, and blue. You can really create a wide spectrum of color with those 3, but I like to experiment and have fun with more. When choosing my pigments, I always get the professional grade larger tubes. The main brands that I like to use are Winsor & Newton and Daniel Smith, among others. Every brand will have a different pigment mixture for each particular color, meaning that if you're used to one color, such as a French ultramarine blue from one company, and you go to another brand, it will differ slightly. In the long run, using the larger tubes saves you money, it has less filler, and the color's better. If you've never painted before or just starting out, the student grade is just fine. And even some companies have larger student grade tubes. And remember to always get transparent watercolor. Now let's take a look at brush containers. Try to make sure that it has a heavy base, instead of something light that could easily tilt over, because this could be devastating if you were working on a painting and it fell on top of it. So what I like to use is an old ceramic container, the kind that you hold your wooden spoons and spatulas in from the kitchen. You can see how much sturdier this is and how it's less likely to tilt over. So how do you know what brushes to choose? You don't necessarily have to buy the most expensive ones, but you do want to have a good sable synthetic blend and a synthetic, because this will determine the ease and success of your painting. As an example, I chose the Da Vinci Cosmotop series. The synthetic with the red handle is called a spin, while the blend has a blue handle and is called a mix. The difference between them is that the spin with the red handle is a synthetic and will hold less water and color, while the mix with the blue handle is a blend of natural hair and fiber and will hold more. For example, watch as I apply these brush strokes and how I easily start to run out of water and color. And in comparison, look how much more the mixed brush can hold. You can now start to get the idea that if you were trying to cover a large area with a synthetic brush, it could be more difficult, and you have the possibility of brushstroke marks. Now I'd like to show you my favorite brushes and the ones that I work with all of the time. I always prefer to work with round brushes because it adds a nice flow to the painting. I like to use a combination of sable synthetic blends and synthetics. The sizes I like to use, and starting with my largest one, is a Cosmotop mix, number 30 and 20, then the Winsor & Newton Scepter Gold series, number 24, 20, 14, along with a Cosmos synthetic, number 8 and number 6. Now I'd like to show you how these brush sizes compare to what most artists use. Here's a number 10, 8, and 6. One of these, which would be an average artist's largest brush, would be one of my smallest. In comparison, you can see the difference. Imagine you were working on a large area, and you used the average size brush. It would take many more brush strokes to cover that area than it would with one of these. Another problem you can have by using the smaller brushes is that your painting can look overworked and dry. Let me show you another example of what I mean. I'm going to take a number 10 synthetic, then on this scratch piece of paper, I'm going to add a little water and color. If you could imagine, if you were working on a painting, there could be a high probability of it looking overworked and dry if you used the wrong kind and size. You can see how I'm almost struggling to cover this area. There are two reasons for this. For one, it's a small brush, and another, it's a synthetic, and it's holding less water. And in comparison, I'm going to use the Cosmotop Mix Sable Synthetic Blend. Look how much easier it is to cover the area with this brush. Now let's take a look at the difference between a round and a flat brush. By applying different pressure to the tip of the brush, I can change the entire look of the stroke. The round brush can help your paintings look a little softer and more natural. And in comparison, I'll use the 2-inch flat Isabe. You can see how I can really change the stroke just by rotating the brush as I move across the paper. And you can really create some beautiful paintings by just using flat brushes. I know some artists will use only one brush for an entire painting, and that's usually the 2-inch Isabe, because it's soft and it holds lots of water. Don't expect to get the same results with a flat brush as a round. I suggest that you experiment and try both of them, and see which one you have the most fun with, because that's probably going to suit your style the best. When holding your brush, try to hold it a little higher up the handle so it's a little looser in your hand. What you're actually doing is looking for the balancing point, a place where you have control and it's still comfortable in your hand. You'd really only want to hold it at the tip if you were working on fine details. And when you're doing that, you also usually reduce the size of your brush. You can see how I'm starting to work a little tighter. Now for a moment, let's talk about water containers. Most people like to use a small container, such as a cup or a glass. The problem with that is that the water gets dirty very quickly, and you'll have to change it more often. Because if you have dirty water, it's not going to keep your color nice and bright. So let me show you the size that I like to use. And by using the larger size, I won't have to change my water as often. You can now see the difference between the smaller container and the larger one. And I think you can tell why I would choose the bigger one. It holds a gallon of water, and I got this at a feed store. Any large container will do. And you can actually even use two containers, one for cleaning and one for applying the water and color. Here's one common mistake that you should never do: leaving the brush tipped down in the water container, because you can permanently damage it and quite possibly not be able to restore it. So ideally, clean off your brushes and get the excess water off on the lip of the container. You can even use a towel. Paper towels work fine too, but I still prefer an old terry cloth. Some artists like to flick their brush to restore the tip and remove any of the excess water. That works great, but make sure that you're not damaging anything with the water that's flying across the room. Now let's talk about palettes. You can see here that mine's pretty messy. This is the one that I use all of the time. If my palette's dirty or I need to re-wet any of the other color, I can use a small spray bottle. Once I have water in the center, I can take a paper towel and help clean it off. You can see that my wells aren't filled with color, because whenever I start a new painting, I always like to add fresh paint. Sometimes, if I've run out of the additional wells to add color, I can always place more color in the center of my palette. But make sure that you leave enough space inside that area for mixing your color. Now let's say you are starting a new palette. I always like to start with my warm colors moving to my cooler ones. I'd begin with my yellows, moving over to my oranges, reds, browns, greens, and blues. And for some reason, I always like to have my indigo in my lower left-hand corner. For the additional empty wells, you can always add other colors or fill them with color mixtures. To help you keep track of the colors that you're using, you can always use a Sharpie permanent marker and write directly on the palette or along the lip. And if you ever want to remove it, use nail polish remover. Another thing you could do is use a small piece of artist tape, because that's easily removable. Using the same idea, write the name on it, and you can place it wherever you want. And if you need to, you can always use masking tape. The only problem with this is that over time it may not be that easy to remove. Another way you can set up the color in your palette is by using a color wheel. This will help you to easily determine what color to use as you work your way around your palette. Another advantage for doing this is that the color directly across is the complementary color, which will help you develop a beautiful neutral gray. Once you've set up your palette, you're now ready to create a wide variety of color. To help you understand what's available to you, I suggest that you make a color chart. This is what I call the light bulb moment. You can use the 8.5 by 11 blank charts that I have available on my site, or make your own. You can even expand the size into a half sheet of watercolor paper. These are 1 by 1 inch squares and a beautiful reference to keep hanging in your studio. And if you want to, you can even enlarge this into bigger squares. But that will be your personal preference. You may even want to consider making more charts when you're changing your pigments. Not all color with the same name are the same. To make your own chart at home, get a good piece of watercolor paper. Then using a ruler, I'd like you to draw horizontal lines moving across and down your paper. And space them approximately 1 inch apart. Work your way all the way down to the bottom. Then repeat the grid, moving vertically across your paper. You can measure them, but you don't really need to be accurate. Just guesstimate. Or to make it easier, you can always go to my website where I have blank charts available already printed on watercolor paper. This can make it less tedious and you're ready to go. Here you can see the basic idea of how the blank chart's going to look after it's completed. But first, I'm going to show you how to mix the color. To start, I'm going to use a little French ultramarine blue and place it on my palette. Then I'm going to fill the first rectangle on the left-hand side on my chart. Then I'll take a little new gamboge, then place that separately on my palette. Then I'll fill in the first rectangle above the first square in the first row. Then I'll mix those two colors together and place it in the corresponding square. You don't need to be perfect, and it doesn't have to go exactly up to the line. What you're trying to do is really get the idea of what the two colors together make. Then I'll move on to the next color, which will be cobalt blue. And again, mix it with the new gamboge. Then place the combination in the corresponding square. Then I'll take the cobalt blue and put it in the rectangle outside the grid area. And to help you keep track of where you are, you can always keep your finger pointed to the area that you're working in. That can be really helpful if you're working out a sequence. Then I'll take the quinacridone gold and mix it with the French ultramarine blue, then move a few squares over. You can now start to get the idea by taking the same blue and mixing it with different colors. You can get a wider variety of combinations. But don't forget to put the pure color on the top or the side of the grid so you can keep track of your combinations. It's really important that you mix your colors well in your palette to get the most accurate combination. And don't forget to label your colors so you can keep track on what you created. There is slightly a quicker way to do this chart, but first I need to clean off my palette. Let's say I wanted to work with only one color, work all the way across, and mix other colors into it. For instance, I'll use permanent sap green. Then I can make a few stations that'll be waiting for the color mixture already on my palette. On this color chart, you can see that I already have the names written in. If you used a blank one, you would have more freedom to write in whatever color you choose. And whatever you decide to do, remember that the color mixture must go into the corresponding square. The color shift can be slight or it can be dramatic. And as I said, this could be your light bulb moment, meaning that all the color can start to make sense. Because many of you are used to getting muddy colors. That usually happens because you're either mixing too many colors together at one time or not waiting for the previous layer to completely dry. The purpose of this exercise is to help you to internalize which colors make what combinations. Here's another thing that some people do. Lay one color down, then come back in and reapply the second color for the mix. But this isn't mixing. This is called glazing. Don't try to speed up the process by doing this, because you really want to see what the beautiful blend of color can actually be. You can kind of get the idea by laying one color down on top of the other, but it's really just not the same. Let's take another look at a completed chart. And this is only a sample of the colors that you can create. Look how much more luminous the colors are when they're actually blended together. And as I said, you can either get the pre-printed blank color charts I have available on my website, or create your own. You can use any of the colors that you already have on hand, or the ones I suggest in this video. Now we're going to work on values and blending. I'm going to use a piece of Arches paper, then take one color, put it on my palette, and blend it well. Then I'm going to come back and place it on the far left side of my paper. Then clean off my brush and get more water, then reapply it to the color. Then I'll place it next to the square I just did, then repeat the process. Clean off my brush, get more water, then add it back to the color. The idea is to gradually start to increase the water and dilute the color. Then I'll continue to add more water to my color as I work my way across the paper, until it's almost becoming completely transparent. Values are something that you really need to know. When I'm working on a landscape, I want to have my darkest values in the foreground and my lightest values in the distance. And for a floral, I want the opposite. The lighter colors in the foreground and the darker ones in the back, because that helps to push the flower forward. Let me show you a couple of examples. In this painting of the Bolinas Mesa, you can see how I have my darkest values in the foreground and in the shadow areas. And in the middle, where I have the grassland, it's more of a medium value. Then as I move off into the distance, you can see how the hills have the lightest values. In contrast, you can see the opposite in this floral. Notice how my whites and lightest values are really enhanced by my darks. My whitest whites look like they're popping out of the painting, while my medium values and shadows help to give it shape and make areas recede. Then my darkest darks are what really helps to push everything forward. Now let's review. I'm going to take quinacridone gold and place it on the left-hand side of my paper. And here it will basically be full strength. And as I move along, I'm going to continue to increase the water to the consistency so the color becomes almost transparent. You can also try the opposite, where you start mostly with water and then continue to add color to increase the color consistency. You can see that this is a very simple exercise, but I suggest that you try this because it helps you to internalize the process. Let's look at a simplified landscape and how using these techniques help to create distance. By using the lighter color in the background and the darker one in the foreground helps to give it depth and dimension. I'll come back to this exercise after we worked with water and blending techniques. I'm using a piece of Arches 140-pound cold press paper. Then I'll take artist tape and place it approximately 2 inches apart, moving down the paper. Then to finish it off, I'll take 2 strips and place it along the sides. The intention is to create rectangular bars. Once it's down, I'll press on the tape to secure it. I'm going to use the number 6 mop brush to apply clean water to the top rectangle. And I'm only going to work one space at a time. Then I'll take a number 14 round brush to apply my color. I'm going to use a little permanent alizarin crimson and place it in the lower left-hand corner of the top rectangle. Then I'll take a little new gamboge and place it in the upper right-hand corner, and allow the two of them to blend into the clean water. Then I'm going to lift my paper up and move it around so both the colors can blend easier. This is not a traditional application to create your wash, but I have found this to be the most effective. Once I'm satisfied with the color blending, I can then move on to the next rectangle and repeat the process. Again, using the number 6 mop brush and applying clean water inside this rectangle. You can see how I'm only working one space at a time. Some colors will want to explode more than others into the clean water, and some won't move hardly at all. Here I'll be using the French ultramarine blue, and you can see that it doesn't really want to move as much, but by using the water I can help push it. Then I'll reapply some alizarin crimson and allow it to move into the French ultramarine blue. This is almost like making the color charts, but you're allowing the colors to mix and blend on the paper. If I have a large puddle, I can always use the tip of my brush to help soak it up. Then I would wash out my brush, dry it off, and come back in and soak up any additional water. Then repeat the process as many times as I have to. To keep the colors blended, continue to move your paper. You can already start to get the idea of how you could create a wonderful sky. Now let me show you another alternative. Here I've already printed the rectangles onto watercolor paper. I'm going to use my number 30 Cosmotop Mix brush to apply my water. And this time I'm going to use the lines as my boundary. Once I put my water down, I'm going to take French ultramarine blue and place it inside the rectangle. And when you're doing this, I only want you to place the color in the corner. Then I'll take alizarin crimson and place it in the upper right-hand corner, and allow the two of them to blend together. Notice how the color is only staying on the inside of the rectangle where I already placed the water, and by moving my paper from side to side, I can really enhance the blending. The water and color are only going to stay in the fluid area. It would be like an ocean coming up to a shore. It's not going to go beyond the dry area. Unless you have a puddle and it's building, and the stress of it can make it run across the paper. And again, if I have too much water, I'll soak it up. Then I'll repeat the water application in the second rectangle. The reason why I want you to keep your color in the corner is so you can see the blending into the clean water. And if you fill in the entire rectangle, you don't get to see the magic. So here I'll apply a little permanent alizarin crimson. I guarantee that you'll have fun with this exercise. It's amazing to watch the colors move and blend. You'll be able to watch as some colors push and others recede, and then by moving the paper, you're able to blend it to wherever you want. If I need additional color, I can always still add it while this is still wet. And if I want to control the edges, all I have to do is take my brush and move it along the side. I know you must be thinking that this is just way too much water, but I'd really like you to experiment with this. People are always asking me, how do I get my blending on my flowers? Well, this is one of those secrets. What's also fun is to touch only a few areas of the bottom of the color and allow the color to spill into the clean water. For the best results on this exercise, you want to use good paper and a brush that holds large amounts of water. You could use a mop, Hockey, or the Cosmotop Mix. Any wash brush will do. For the paper, I suggest Arches 140 pound. You can even work with 90 pound if you'd like. If you use a student grade, the results may not be the same. Remember to keep your paper moving so the colors can blend well. Using the same idea of the rectangles on the paper, let me show you what happens if you're using the standard size brush that most artists use. And I'm willing to bet that you probably use this size the most often, if not smaller. And I'm also willing to say that you probably even apply your paint this way. You can see how much harder it is to get the color to move, and how I have to move quickly, otherwise I can end up with unwanted brushstroke marks. I know you're going to feel that you have more control over this application, but it won't have a fluid appearance. Also, depending on your color mixture, the colors could even separate a little easier. I'm sure that you noticed one difference was I was applying this to dry paper, and the other I was using a synthetic brush. That's why the tip was unable to hold enough water and color. It'll depend on what you want to work on that will determine the type of brush that you use. Imagine using this technique on barns or fences. You can even use it on rocks. Notice how I can intentionally try to catch the tooth of the paper. As I'm filling in this rectangle, notice the top. You can see how it's lighter. That's because it's drying quicker than the bottom half. If the drying times are different, that's how you can end up with unwanted blossoming effects in your paintings. By using the blending and mixing techniques that I just showed you, I would have less of a problem with it, because the surface would be constantly moving. If you're painting in the traditional way that watercolorists always do, your paper would be attached to a board. That means you would be less likely to pick it up and move it around, which can prevent you from having fun and watching the color flow. I'd also like you to be aware of how you're handling the tip of your brush and the pressure you're applying. If you press too hard, you can pick up the pigment. And this can work just fine if you want to remove some color, but you can also damage the surface. Keep an eye on the rectangle with the quinacridone gold, and watch how the color starts to resettle back into the area where I just lifted the color. You can see how a scar is being created. And in comparison, let me show you both applications side by side. Wet into wet and wet on dry. You can also see how much more luminous the colors are on the example on the right. The color flows and blends and looks almost effortless, while the colors on the left can have a labored appearance and look like I was struggling with them. Before we continue on with any more exercises, let me show you how to cut a full sheet of paper down to size and also create those deckled edges. This is a full 22 by 30 sheet of Arches 140-pound cold press paper. It's really a simple process. All you have to do is fold your paper over, and then fold it over again, and continue to weaken that seam. Once you've weakened the fold, the paper becomes very pliable and easy to tear. This technique gives you the appearance of a beautiful deckled edge instead of a cut hard line. Then I'll move my paper over to the edge of the table and begin to tear it. Notice the placement of my hand and how I'm applying pressure as I'm tearing. Then I'll continue to tear it this way as I work my way down the seam. You can see how the edges are much softer. And if you did a painting to the edge, you could even float the piece. Here's another technique to achieve the same results. I'll fold the paper over and make sure that my edges are matching equally. Then again, I'm going to work my seam, folding it back and forth. Then I'll face it down with the fold pointing up. Then take a straight edge and place it along the seam. Then, as I did on the table, I'll begin to tear it. I'll continue to hold the pressure down as I move along. Here again you can see the soft deckled edge. Now let's take a look at some traditional applications of watercolor washes. I'm going to use a small masonite board just in case I decide I want to get some angle to it. To help it stick to the board, you can either brush or spray the back with clean water. I'm going to be using a number 10 Isabey Squirrel Quill brush. It holds lots of water and color, and it's really fun to use. Then I'm slowly going to start adding my water and color together on my palette and blend it well, so I don't have any little bits of color in there. Some brushes that look like this are not the same. Either they're too soft or they don't hold enough water. For the best prices on artist materials, check out mail order catalogs. You can usually get up to 40 to 50% off. Now to get that angle I was talking about, I'll take a roll of artist tape and place it under the board. By placing the board on an angle, it can help with the color blending. Here I'll be working on a gradiated wash. Starting at the top and working on dry paper, I'm going to be placing my most saturated color. Then as I start to work my way down to the bottom, I'm increasing my water. It's similar to those value exercises. You can start to get the idea of how this could create a beautiful sky, the dark blue above, and the gradual lightening of color down to the horizon. Notice how quickly I'm working. That way I can work my way back up and help blend the colors even more. Remember, if I was using a synthetic brush, it would be a lot more difficult to cover an area quickly. Notice the streaks on the surface. If I don't move my paper, it could easily stay this way. The traditional watercolor method is to soak your paper first, then attach it to a board, so it lays flat. I never do this. I like the freedom of being able to move my paper whenever and however I want to. What you'll notice from all of my videos is that I never attach the paper to a board. I like to have the freedom of being able to move it around. If you're using a lighter weight paper, you may end up with buckling effects, but I'm going to show you how to resolve that. Now let's move on to an even wash. I'm again going to use Arch's 140-pound cold press paper. Your paper surface is going to make all the difference in the world. If you use a student grade or a different brand, you may become very frustrated because not all papers react the same. Now starting at the top, I'm going to work my way down. And I'm not going to be concerned if I missed an area. I'm going to work all the way down, then along the sides, then even it out. Again, if I was using a synthetic brush, it would be more difficult to cover this area quickly because it would hold less water and color. Notice how I hold my paper, the direction and angle, and how the colors can begin to blend. And if it doesn't move exactly the way I want to, I can add more water and help it blend even more. I'm moving quickly because I don't want one area to dry faster than another. And the additional water is what helps the color move. You can see how the streaking is starting to slowly disappear. Now this becomes beautifully even. Next I'd like to show you how I like to create my washes. But first I have to clean off my painting surface. My painting surface is actually a piece of plexiglass on a table. This makes it really easy to clean up any spills. Then I'm going to prepare my paper just as I showed you, folding it in half and working that fold. Then tearing it along the edge. The way I like to apply my washes is by flooding the surface. I like to use a bamboo hake brush. The only disadvantage is that it can lose hair easily. Many artists will like to use a synthetic 3-inch Skyflow brush designed specifically for this purpose, but I still prefer the bamboo one because I love the amount of water that it holds. As I'm applying my color, you can start to see one of the hairs that was left from the brush, which can be really annoying. What I don't want you to do is try to remove this with your fingers, or you can easily damage the surface of the paper. So instead, use a small, clean synthetic brush and gently lift it out. Notice how quickly I'm moving to apply my color. And again, there's more of those magical little hairs. But I'm not going to worry about this until after I've put my color down. If you're a beginner, you may want to use one of the nylon wash brushes because you will be less likely to have this problem. Then I'll go back in and remove the unwanted hair. Some people like to leave that in the wash until the painting's complete. The problem with that is that you can have unwanted white lines because the hair can act like a resist. This may not look very attractive right now because the colors look really separated, but I'm going to use the same technique that I showed you by allowing the color to blend into each other. For any areas that aren't covered by pigment, I can go in and reapply a little water, and then it can blend into the wash. As I said, many artists will have their watercolor paper attached to a board and work completely flat. You can see the flexibility I have and how I can move the color to wherever I want it to go. It's a beautiful integration of color. Imagine this as a sunset or even a sunrise. Perhaps this could even be the gentle blending of color on a petal. All of these techniques are really universal. The only difference is the subject. Now once I'm satisfied with the color blending, I'm going to reevaluate the surface and see how wet it is. If it's really glossy, any additional color that I add will disperse. What I'm looking for is more of a matte appearance because I want to have control over my next placement of color. In this exercise, I'm going to create a simplified landscape and refer back to the value exercise that we worked on. I'm going to be using cobalt blue on a synthetic brush with less water. Then simply apply 2 strokes of color approximately 2/3 of the way up my paper. Notice how I'm not overworking this, and this will help to create the illusion of clouds in the distance. And then I'll allow the colors to blend just a little. Then I'll move this around to help with the blending. Then once I'm satisfied, I'm going to allow this to dry. So what we'll be working on with this exercise is building color, layering, and value changes. Once dry, you might be really surprised on how much lighter the color is. That's why understanding your materials and how the colors move is really important. To apply my second layer, this time I'm going to use a Robert Simmons Skyflow brush. You can see how different this is. It applies water evenly and it won't lose hair. But it won't apply as much water as the bamboo one. As I'm mixing my color, notice the top half of the paper. You can see how the color didn't dry evenly. There's a couple things that could cause this. When you're cleaning your surface, try to use only clean water. If you use any type of chemical or cleaning agent, it could easily start to come through the paper. This could also be a result of the sizing of the paper itself. I'll show you how to fix this by creating layers. I've started at the top and I'm working my way down and gently applying my brush strokes. I'm not scrubbing the surface, I'm just trying to cover the area. I'm also using a number 24 round sable synthetic blend. It holds a lot of water and color, and it's soft enough not to damage the layer underneath. To help blend this sky into the rest of the painting, I'm going to use my Skyflow brush and gently work my way down to the bottom. Then I'll lift my paper again, rotate it, and move the water and color around. Once I'm satisfied, I want to wipe off my painting table. That way I won't have any unwanted backwashes into the painting. If I need to blend the color more, I can again use my Skyflow brush and just gently go along the surface. But this time, I don't want it to have a lot of water. I just want it wet enough to be able to blend the color. And at this point, while the surface is still damp, I'm going to rework the clouds to add more color. Notice how I try to get the maximum results with the least amount of brush strokes. and how by lifting the paper and moving the water and color, it all works together. Then I'll wipe my painting surface again, then allow it to dry. Then once it's completely dry, I'm going to reevaluate the color. I'll decide if I want to keep it this way or if I want to intensify it. If I need it to be richer, I have to add another layer. And before I do anything, I need to make sure that it's completely dry, or I could easily lift the color underneath and have unwanted brushstroke marks. You can see that I'm not really being very delicate on how I apply my brushstrokes. I just want to get the water on the surface. You may want to be aware of trying to work in only one direction. You could start from left to right. One problem you could have by applying it in the way I am is that if your pigment is not completely dry on the previous layer, you could streak the surface. Now I'll be adding my third and final layer. You can already see how the color looks richer and darker. Notice how I'm only applying the color to the areas that I've already worked. By not having it attached to a board, you can see how flexible and pliable it is, and the integration of color is blending beautifully. If there's just too much water rolling on the surface, I can take a paper towel and gently wipe my edge. Then I'll reevaluate this, and I decided I need a little more color in the clouds. So I'll apply a little cobalt blue with only a couple strokes. Then using the same blending techniques, I'll help move it around. If you can notice the surface, you can see a light shine, so it's not completely flooded with water and it's not dull as a matte appearance, but it has a nice even look. As I'm looking at this, I'm thinking that the horizon looks a little too washed out. So while it's still damp and color is still able to blend, I'm going to add a little New Gamboge and alizarin crimson mix. This is not only a value exercise, this helps to give you the idea of how to actually work with watercolor. If you've worked with any other mediums, you're probably used to starting with your darks and then ending with your lights. In watercolor, you're thinking backwards. You're starting with your light colors and working to your darks, because your light or white areas are really going to be determined by the transparency of how little color you have on them. Before I can work on any of the details, I need to let this layer completely dry. Look how light this becomes, but the blend is beautiful. Now I'm going to use an entirely different approach. This time I'm not going to wet the surface, I'm going to work directly on dry paper. I'll create an outline with my brush, then wash the color all the way down to the bottom. I'm going to create a mountain range using my lightest values first. What I'm trying to show you is how to do a watercolor painting without thinking that you have to paint every detail separately, which can be used as one technique. If I decide I want to change any of the shape, I can still do that while the paper's damp. Then before I continue on, I'll need to let this dry again. Once dry, check it with the back of your hand, and if it's cool to the touch, it's still too damp. You'll want to have this almost bone dry. This way you'll have a nice sharp edge, and your color won't feather out. This exercise can end up having the feel of a southwestern scene. If you're further north, you may want to substitute the colors that I'm using for the mountains for more blues, such as a French ultramarine blue and a burnt umber. On my second mountain range, I'm using my medium values. Then using the same technique, I'll wash it all the way down to the bottom. Then I'll allow this to dry. If you want to speed up the drying process, you can always use a hairdryer. Just hold it far enough away so the water and color dry evenly. Now working with my third and final layer, this is going to be the most saturated color, meaning that it's going to have more pigment and less water. Now you can really get the idea of how the darker colors come forward and the lighter ones recede. Next time you're outside, try to notice the value changes in the landscape. Now you'll know how to apply it to a painting. If you want to add some trees to the horizon line, don't wait for it to completely dry. Use a smaller synthetic and randomly place some lines along the edge. This way it can blend into the rest of the color. If you want more mountains, use the same idea by using these value changes. Now let's talk just a little bit about paper surfaces. How do you know what is the right side of the paper, especially when you're buying sheets? What you'll be looking for is something called the watermark. It's usually in the corner, and it's the side where the brand name is spelled correctly. You really are able to use both sides, but I'm going to show you the side I prefer to work on. The top side will be a little smoother, while the back side will have more of a texture to it. Both sides are going to act exactly the same in how they move the color and absorbency. You will also notice on the back side that the brand name is spelled backwards. If you divide your paper into a half sheet or quarters, you can always mark the back with a small X. Now let's look at the difference between hot and cold press paper. Your paper surface is going to affect the outcome of your painting, even if you're using the same techniques. You can see that I've applied the same color mixture to the paper above. This is hot press paper, and it has a very smooth surface to it. The water and color like to sit more on top, and the absorbency is not the same. You can also see if I use a sedimentary color, such as the French ultramarine blue in this color mixture, it has more of a granular texture to it. Hot press paper can be really interesting to work with, but don't expect the outcome to be the same. Just for fun, I'm going to use a splattering technique. See if you notice any difference. Many botanical or scientific illustrators like to use hot press paper. Because the surface is so smooth, you're able to get fine detail. And that kind of painting would be done with a lot less water than what I'm showing you. It would be more of a dry-on-dry technique, meaning a brush full of pigment, but still considered dry, on dry paper. To really help you see the comparison, I'm going to show you a couple examples. The painting on the bottom is done on hot press, while the painting on the top is on cold. The lemons on the top are a lot smoother and have more depth, while the ones on the bottom are a little more flat and have more backwashes. Notice how the hot press gives the impression of what a traditional watercolor looks like, with backwashes and little windows of color, and while on the cold press I was able to achieve better blending techniques. Now let's take a look at another composition on hot press paper. You can see how the color has a luminous quality to it. That's because it sits more on top. If you want a real traditional watercolor appearance, try hot press. Now notice the difference between these two pairs. One is on hot and the other's on cold. In part 2, I'll be working on this composition on both hot and cold press paper, so you can see how each one reacts differently. We'll also be working on creating more layers to enhance color, along with many other tips and techniques and simple compositions.